Holy hell! At least that's what we're going to be talking about today in my review for Castlevania on the Nintendo 64. And I want to call this 3D Castlevania because that's exactly what it is. It's Castlevania's first venture into 3D gaming. And this game is a very interesting specimen because it came out at a time where video game developers and producers were moving on from their 2D roots in search of the newer audience and their desires for immersive 3D worlds. And as such, a lot of people are quick to discredit this game based on the strengths of the classic two-dimensional Castlevania games. And while I don't necessarily disagree, I do think this game has a certain sense of majesty that's worth your attention. So, without further hesitance, please bear with me as I investigate why this game deserves your attention. Yeah. Castlevania.
Deep in his castle, he stirs from a century of enforced sleep. Count Dracula awakes. Reinhard Schneider.
Reinhard Schneider. With a name like that, you know this game is going to be good. And rightfully so, because this is Castlevania's first ever venture into 3D. So it's clear that the developers were trying to make a statement with this game. Now, off the bat, you should be able to recognize that the game is sort of going for a spooky feel. It's not horror per se, but the game definitely gives the player a run for their money in terms of fright and anticipation. There's a lot of suspense in the game, and I think the game does a very good job at capitalizing on this with its method of storytelling. The story is not that complex per se, but the method of telling via excellent cinematography and captivating music really enhance the telling of what's otherwise a straightforward narrative. Now, while I'm on the topic of cinematography, it is only right that I address the camera angles, which really do plague the gameplay a little bit. That's one of the biggest criticisms for this game, is that the camera angles almost break it and make it unplayable. Yet there are a few methods for the player to accommodate themselves with the camera. There are 3 separate camera styles that will revolve around the player differently, and the R shoulder button will also center the player's focus, at least when these buttons are able to be used. And it's not perfect per se. It is kind of interesting that this came out after Zelda Ocarina of Time, which revolutionized 3D gaming with the Z targeting system. But at the same time, I can see why they were going for something different. To me, it sort of speaks on the game's spooky telling. It's not like the first Resident Evil where the camera angles are stale per se, but it is trying to go for that sense of suspense and getting the player to feel in the game and in the middle of a folk tale. And in that respect, I can see why they chose the camera angles they did. Now this brings me into the topic of the game's overall challenge, and this can be a very brutal action platformer at times, and I did feel, at least the first time around, that it was just seemingly a bit unfair. And there's one sequence in this game where you've got to carry Nitro down a few levels without getting hit by any enemies and walking perfectly without jumping, and you got to know exactly where to put it. And this is to me one of the most difficult procedures in the game. However, now that I've done it a couple times, it's really not too bad. As long as you know what you're doing, things sort of fall into place. Now, I've also read many complain about the game's controls, but if you're used to a 3D Zelda game, then it's really not much different. The major complication for this game is the persistence of obnoxious enemy behavior, as well as some tragically unresponsive platforming segments. You know, oftentimes there are points in this game where I'm playing and it seems like it's almost impossible to avoid damage. Even some of the boss battles are tragically difficult, but I think it's a really good challenge if you're into that. And the game is very fair. It offers save points frequently, so you shouldn't feel hesitant about using them. Also, there's a couple neat tricks, like each time you get into a new level, your health bar will restore. So that is very useful if you're trying not to use all of your health supplies, which are sort of hard to come by. Actually, one of the main reasons I was interested in this game in the first place is because it reminded me of a Zelda game with a bit more emphasis on challenging action and platforming, as well as a very dark mystique and sense of adventure. It's also something new that I haven't really experienced in the genre, so in all of those respects, it delivers with a serious dosage from evil. I interpolate this game as a holy hell for a reason. It is tough, but also to the point of really bestowing a feeling of eminence upon completion of some of the more difficult tasks. If you're into rewarding gameplay, this game really does give you that sense of satisfaction. There are a few moments in the game that did feel cheap the first few times around. However, now that I'm more accustomed to the game, it's really not as difficult as I had remembered from the first playthrough. But for those playing it for the first time, you're in for a challenge. So I think you should do your best to really try and enjoy the challenge and get the most out of it. There are some segments that are frustrating to complete. I won't dismiss that aspect of the game. But if you're into the 3D action adventure platforming genre, and if you have a withstanding personality, then I think you'll find a lot to love here. I wouldn't recommend this title if I didn't see any merit in it. But between the inherent pathos appeal, enriched through enticing music and clever storytelling, the sense of suspenseful adventure, further supplemented by the many challenges, the epic cinematography which transforms the game into an interactive folktale, and my unashamed love for polygon graphics, I can't help but give Castlevania's 3D undertaking the nod of approval. It does have room for improvement, but if players are tolerant enough to take the rough edges of the game with a grain of salt, then they'll be rewarded with one of the finest games the N64 has to offer. It's also important not to allow your unabashed bias towards the 2D Castlevania games to get in the way, because if you feel like that's going to be the case, then you probably won't enjoy this game as much. But really, I do only recommend this game to those that are genuinely interested. I was motivated to check it out after seeing some footage, and can confirm that motivation is really what pulled me through the game. So in case I've interested you, and you want to prove to yourself that you're a master of 3D action-adventure platforming, then by all means, Castlevania 64 should be right for you.